What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Major Mixtape podcast. I'm your host, Jason. Hope you're doing well. Look, our next guest on this show, author of Your Favorite Band Cannot Save You. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase from Wedding the Musical when I say he is actor, singer, writer, and threat to Homeland Security. Scotto Moore, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. It's a great flashback introduction you just did there. Appreciate that.
I couldn't not bring that up because one of the things that I was really fascinated about when I was doing research for this is just how much music is in your background. But first, let's talk about the book, Your Favorite Band Cannot Save You. How did that come to be? Like, where was the genesis of the idea?
So the genesis of it was I just had a flash insight of that kind of opening section of the book where it's a piece of music that can be so beautiful that it transcends, any kind of rational defense against it. And just, that kind of concept had at its core, there's beauty in it, if you can imagine that, kind of potentially something angelic, but there's also something kind of horrible about the idea of something so beautiful that that it just takes over your soul a little bit. And I started noodling on it. This was several years ago, and put it away for a while because mostly at the time I was a playwright. So I think I got a chapter and a half into it and went, this is pretty good. Maybe someday I'll finish this. I didn't conceive of myself as a prose writer back then. And, but after a while, I came back to it and I was like, I developed this blog or this Tumblr called Things That Cannot Save You. And it had probably, the biggest audience of anything I'm ever going to have. It was pretty ridiculous. It's a Lovecraft themed snark blog where we just make fun of stuff. I realized, I have an audience here. I could write that book and I could just self-publish it and I could just show it to these people, who are following along. And so that motivated me to go back and finish it and get it done as a novella. And the twists and turns of that just kind of, it was written on the fly. I didn't have an outline at the time. I mean, certainly I rewrote it to smooth over the problems that generated. But at the time I was just really motivated I wanted to see what would happen with the concept. I had no idea. And that's kind of what led to it.
Now, in the book, the main character happens to, have a blog called Much Preferred Customers, and that actually does exist. So how much of you is in the main character?
I would probably say quite a bit. I mean, the main character in the book is definitely a little shares some sense of humor with me and shares kind of a snarky outlook on the music industry and kind of where it's headed. But I think the main character is also a little more credulous than me. I think a little more, the main character in the book is a lot younger than I am. And so it's potentially parallel to me when I was younger and really was a fanboy of certain artists and really wanted to, chase them around on tour. I don't do that anymore. But back then it was like really exciting to try to get an autograph backstage or to try to do all these things. And so the other difference is that my blog, Much Preferred Customers, is nowhere near as popular as the blog in the book. And so when MPC makes interview requests and things of that nature, and people take that seriously in a way that would never happen with me. So that's kind of a projection into fantasy land, if you will. Yeah.
Now, the other thing too about the main character is, they're very into, there's this whole almost competition about, finding the next big thing before anyone else really does. Is there an actual community where it's literally like people are trying to one up each other on finding the most awesome music out there before anyone else?
I don't know that there is such a community. I'm certainly not a part of one. I was blogging for a very long time. I think I started I started probably 15 years ago, music blogging. I had a blog before this called Comfort Music, and I always wanted to find a hook into some kind of community, some kind of secret Discord server where all the bloggers hung out. And when I never got invited to anything like that, I decided to imagine that as part of this book, and just figured that would be cool. I don't feel competition from the sense of I don't have resources that, a Pitchfork or even probably Stereo Gum or some of these places have to really be out front. I learn what's new from them as much as anybody. What I do is filter it down to, Pitchfork is going to post every single press release that they can, probably. I mean, they it's a fire hose. And part of what I do is, for my audience, is I narrow it down to, well, this is the subset of things you might be interested in. And I think every blogger out there, the one cool thing I kind of get from the blogging community is they don't waste a lot of time telling you what they don't like. It's not a negative zone. It's more about, I'm going to take the time to tell you about something I do like. And that makes a difference in terms of connecting with people, I think.
One of the things you do see a lot in, not necessarily like, the main music blogging community, but there just seems to be almost a hip coolness about ripping whatever the big band of the time is. Nickelback is notorious for being, the most hated band, even though they're not a bad band. So is it important for music fans, music bloggers, and to really put out there a more positive spin, and for the narrative to change? Just because they're big doesn't mean they're not cool.
I mean, I can only speak to my own personal preference. But I've seen other people echo this online enough to kind of, imagine that it's true, is you can have a really big name artist doing really cool stuff. And that it's used to me when I was young, seem contradictory, that the more popular and mainstream you got, the harder it would be for you to be edgy and kind of do the cool, stuff that connects with, not just kids, but the hipsters or whatever. I kind of grew out of that opinion. And part of it was I developed this obsession for looking for music videos as part of my blog, really paying attention to that as an art form. And the bigger the name, the more access to they'll get a bigger budget, but they'll also get the more creative directors and the more creative designers, art directors, and that kind of thing. And you see them today, some of the best videos come from these unexpected places where they're super popular, and they're doing very psychedelic stuff. They're doing very edgy stuff. They're pushing the boundaries in ways that I wouldn't have expected when I was younger. So I think it's a lot easier for me to just assume the best out of everybody and go, whether it's somebody like The Weeknd or some little tiny band that just came out of Indianapolis, they all have equal shot at being pretty awesome if their head's in the right spot. So
it is interesting that you bring up, music videos, and on this show, over numerous interviews with different guests, the conversation has been, much music here in Canada or MTV down in the States, they don't really show music anymore. So the fact that, the music video is still obviously a thing because it's still out there, and, you have YouTube and whatnot. Is it almost a good thing, you would think, for, music TV stations to not showing those videos? In that way, artists can be more avant-garde with their videos without having to worry about broadcast standards.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, you can just take the example of The Weeknd. Half of the stuff that he's put out recently wouldn't make it onto any kind of television station, but it's really cutting edge, So I think YouTube, they say YouTube's the biggest streaming media service. It's where all the action is in terms of both music and video, and so they're not having any problem finding an audience without these TV outlets backing them up. They're not having any problem staying true to their own vision. YouTube has some standards and practices, obviously there's certain things that they can't do, but they're more lenient, it seems, with the music video format. The music videos that I've seen, they let them get away with certain things that they don't let everybody get away with, for sure. And you can see some complaints about that here and there, where, for instance, they don't let comic artists or animators get away with certain things, but if you've got the backing of a major record label, you can get away with a lot of stuff. That's kind of a side track, but the point being, YouTube is absolutely, been a boon to the music video field, and it's introduced me to 100 different directors who I never would have drilled into their work in the same way if I didn't have it all kind of archived and cataloged in one spot for me like that.
Now, in the book, the band that the main character follows is Beautiful Remorse. When you were writing the book, was there any band out there that you kind of looked to as, if you ever had to cast this book as a movie, if there was a band that you would kind of put up there as the band?
There wasn't a specific band. There was a sense I had from the way some of my friends followed certain bands in college, and that I wanted to kind of replicate that sense of awe that I used to see, but I didn't have anybody specific that I was trying to mirror. There are some bands that don't exist anymore that my friends followed in college very religiously. And I liked these bands, but I didn't kind of, jump up and down in the same way. But that was something I was definitely remembering was, you can go nuts. You can go really nuts over a band that is only playing, nightclubs in college towns and hasn't broken out yet. And that's kind of where Beautiful Remorse actually came from, that sense that they started off, as a college band in Madison. Their roots are in that scene and before they broke out.
Now, one of the I don't know if it was intentional or not, but the fact that the band in the book Beautiful Remorse is basically releasing a track at a time, and you're starting to see bands that are now releasing a track at a time rather than compiling all the songs and then releasing an album, even though albums the idea of going out to a record store and buying an album these days is starting to become fleeting. Right. Do you think that's almost like, a sign of the times where the idea of the front to back, here's an album with all of its packaging is almost gone?
It's funny because what I see as a blogger is what you just described. Like, you'll get half of the album released as singles before the album's ever ready to come out. And half of them will have music videos, even really full-fledged things to promote ostensibly the album. What I find is that by the time I've seen 6 music videos from an album, I'm mostly like less inclined to go check out the rest of the album, because I feel like I've seen it. And it isn't true. I understand that. But I posted something snarky on Twitter at one point, which was, I think the basic, the limit for a musical unit should be 4 songs. Like I past 4 songs and my attention wanes and I am not going to check it out. I think, the EP, 4-song EP is perfect. And that was a little snarky because if if Peter Gabriel puts out an album and he's somebody that I've loved for a long time, I might listen to the whole album out of respect or whatever. But some of these bands that I've never heard of, if I've heard 4 songs, I feel like I probably don't necessarily need to hear the other 8, and that's wrong. But there's so much new music coming out that there's always this like the guy in the they say in the book, the bloggers in the book say, we're looking for the next best song. And that isn't going to be when an artist puts out their first 4 singles, those are what the artist probably thinks are the best songs. Those are it becomes less attractive to kind of check out, well, what are the lesser songs, the ones that didn't deserve this attention or promotion. And it's a catch-22 because you're probably missing out on a ton of great stuff. But there's a ton of great stuff coming out every day. It's a fire hose, so if you want breadth over depth, then you're looking for the next artist.
Now, aside from being a novelist, of course, you have another book coming out soon, Battle of the Linguist Mages. But you mentioned earlier that you were a playwright. And one of the things that you have created in the past is Silhouette, which is a sci-fi acapella musical. Now, can you tell us a little bit about this? Because when I read the description, I'm like, that is fascinating. I've never put those 3 together, but I'm curious now.
Well, I've been hooked on acapella music since college, and I had an acapella group for years called Elegant Catastrophe Singers, which performed around Seattle, and never quite hit that zone where we were amazing or where we were capable of punching through a local scene or whatever. But I got a taste of what it was like to kind of get close to that. And what's cool about theater is you pull together, unlike a band, let's say, where you're trying to harness people for an indeterminate outcome and you're going to try to keep them together for years and who knows what's going to happen. With theater, you pull together really talented artists for a very distinct project. You jam really hard on it with rehearsals and performances, and then they're all free to go and do their own thing. And so I thought, well, this might be a way to get to hear some of the, to get to create some acapella music that is a little more elevated than what I was able to accomplish in a band. And by the same token, I've always, I wrote a lot of science fiction when I was a playwright. And so the idea of marrying those 2 forms it didn't seem obvious, but it eventually clicked with me that was going to be, that I had a story that was operatic enough to require music. because that's kind of the thing, you know, I didn't want to just wedge music into something. It had to be kind of epic in scope and emotional in a specific way that required people to sing. So yeah, we pulled it together, and the album is on Bandcamp. There's both a live recording from the show and then studio recording, which we put together after the fact, and it turned out really well. We you know, Annex Theater in Seattle was a big supporter of my work for years, and their motto is to, you know, create bold new work in an atmosphere of, you know, well, I forget what it is, in an atmosphere of complete risk and chaos, you know, and this, you know, when we tried to sell this to them, they had the same reaction, which was, you know, that's absurd. That doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense. And so they went for it, which is their way of doing things. And we worked for probably 10 weeks in rehearsals to get, you know, probably 20 songs up and running, and there it went.
When you think about, you know, the idea of a musical, you know, and equated to, you know, a band putting an album together, it's very much like, you know, the concept album. So were you, when, you know, in your own personal taste, were you someone who would listen to concept albums, and did that, you know, kind of lead into the idea of writing Silhouette?
I was more into, you know, so when I think of concept albums, I can't come up with too many more than like the early Genesis albums and some of the Yes albums and stuff that feels a little prog rocky to me. Like, I loved a lot of those albums and still do, but mostly what I also listened to a lot of musicals growing up, and I remember singing, you know, Jesus Christ Superstar and in my car over and over again, and Chess and some of these other ones, and I was in a few musicals growing up, and so I think I was mostly trying to think of a way to do something in that musical theater doesn't do very often, which is a cappella music. Like, that was more my hook, I think. There's not, you know, we did a little bit of research, and I think there's only been 2 other a cappella musicals, you know, before ours that we could find any evidence of. That might not be the case anymore, but back then that was true. So,
and I mean, Silhouette's not the only play you've done. You know, there's been Balconies, there's been other stage work. So, you know, as far as writing for the stage is in comparison to writing, you know, a novel, you know, what were the challenges in going from playwright to writing the book?
Yeah, it's an interesting question to me, because, you know, I've had a long history of assuming that, you know, because I know enough about playwriting that I can branch out into some other art form and it'll be good enough for me to learn the rest on my feet. But that isn't always true, certainly. And I had to relearn some skills to kind of get, you know, I wrote a bunch of prose novels in my 20s that are terrible, but I mean, I cranked out a lot of bad prose. And so fortunately, like, I had some experience under my belt of realizing, you know, the first draft is going to be terrible. You got to go back and rework it, you know, but the main hook for me that got me crossed over was doing it in first person. Made the voice of the book feel to me like I was just writing dialogue, and that's, you know, the main skill for me as a playwright. You know, was one of the main skills was crafting really realistic dialogue that had a voice. You know, dialogue that, you know, because realism per se, you're not trying to replicate a person's voice exactly, because you get a lot of ums and uhs. People go to the theater because they want to see a rarefied version of reality. They want to see something that's sharper and kind of a little more polished, but still feels real. And so I was able to bring some of that over to prose. And by that, you know, by now, you know, I'm several books ahead of the ones that have been published, and I'm starting to experiment with third person, both omniscient and limited, and doing all the in second person and all these things. But that was the main hook, was like realizing that the book had you know, the main character had a voice. And once I nailed that, everything kind of flowed in terms of the storytelling after that. Yeah.
And to throw in, you know, just another wrench into the, you know, the writing styles, you've also done some YouTube series, including the Coffee Table and Cherub. So, you know, now you've done playwright, you know, so writing for the stage, you've done writing for prose, and now you're throwing in like scripted series. So again, like the transition from writing from one to the other, did you find it was easier to, or did you find it was one of those you wrote it and then hoped that the visuals would kind of match?
Um, well, I like to think that when I was writing web series content that I knew kind of the scope of what my team was capable of and kind of wrote for that. I don't know that that's true because you don't always, I don't know if that turned out to be true. I think I was ambitious sometimes in ways that pushed people unnecessarily, maybe. But I mean, it's that balance between really wanting to do something creative and really only having a very small amount of money to spend on it. What can you get done? And the answer is usually, the coffee table ran for 3 seasons and has a tiny cult following, but it didn't really break out in terms of popularity. It didn't, have that kind of moment where, these days it'd be like on TikTok and maybe we'd go viral or something, but we didn't have. Part of it is you can spend a lot of money to build something and then not have any money to promote something. And that was the catch-22 for us is, we poured everything that I had into making it happen, from a production standpoint, and didn't have anything really left to go out and tell people about it the way we could have.
Yeah. Now, when you sit down to write, like how do you kind of, fill your writing scenario? Like, do you have music playing? Do you prefer it quiet? Are you one of those people who has mentally has a soundtrack for what should be going on or should be playing, as if you're trying to visualize it as a movie?
I definitely have music playing in my life kind of all the time. And that's no exception when I'm writing. I tend to want sort of driving house music or electronic music, something that has a strong beat and few, if any, vocals. I don't spend time creating playlists per piece of work, and I know that that's a very successful tactic for a lot of the authors that I follow. They'll spend time crafting that and then use it to get into the mood of the book when they sit down to write. But for me, I just need something that has a lot of energy, because it's easy to kind of flag, or it's easy to kind of slump when you're writing and you got to do another 500 words today and you're not feeling it. It's like when I put on that music, it just gives me a little edge. And then, so I don't look back and go, I associate this book with that piece of music. It's more just that in general, I always have music playing and I just tune it to what I'm doing.
I'm glad you brought up the electronic music, because if anyone was to go over to your SoundCloud page, there are these really long, 2-hour long, house ambient electronic, I don't know whether they're live sessions or they're recorded sessions that have kind of gone on, throughout the duration of the pandemic. So, how did that come about?
Well, so I wanted to become kind of I guess an amateur DJ as a hobby, and not something where I have ever imagined I would go and play clubs or try to become a real, working DJ, but what they call a bedroom DJ, where I just sit in my office here. I've got my DJ controller and I just play. And I've played at parties, for friends and events for friends and whatnot. So I have a taste of what that's like, but I don't really promote myself other than on SoundCloud, where I'll sit down, and those mixes are probably 75% of them or more are planned, where I think them through, I rehearse them, taking tracks in and out to kind of make sure that everything fits the vision of that particular playlist. And then I record it. A few of them are live sets from the parties that I've done. And, you can tell the older they get, the rougher they get, but I took down the worst offenders. So if people want to listen to stuff on my SoundCloud page, usually it's going to be worth listening to. And it does span a blend of stuff. Like I mostly play house music when I'm out. I played a lot of progressive house music, but on my own, I love all kinds of electronic music, and ambient music and chill and all that stuff is something that I pursue as well. So it's all there. Yeah.
You saw during the pandemic, especially, a rise of people becoming, as you put it, bedroom DJs, popping up on Twitch, popping up on Mixer and these different streaming platforms. And as we're coming out of a year and a half of staying at home, and, people are understandably going to be cautious about going to clubs or going to concerts and the like. Do you see people, leaning towards these kind of performances and these kind of streams as a way to kind of at least still stay in touch with that love of live music.
Definitely. I mean, there's no substitute for live music in a sense, but especially with DJs who are paying attention to their audience and their Twitch channels and kind of interacting with people as you go, it is one of the next best things is to kind of have at least that connection. I followed DJs during the pandemic. I didn't follow live musicians as much. So I don't know how effective that's been for that type of crowd, but I think what I hear is, people don't really want these streams to go away. And when it's over, and the pandemic is quote unquote behind us, there's every reason to want to see these streams continue. And I just don't know if they're economically feasible for bands to kind of, they can't rely on that kind of thing as an income stream. But a DJ, like some of the DJs that I follow will get bored, and on a Friday night, they'll just do a live stream out of nowhere. And that's really special. That's hard to replicate in a live setting. Yeah.
Now, this is a bit of an interesting dichotomy because I'm up here in Canada and we're still a ways away from, getting live music kind of back to, what it once was. But of course, you're down in the States, you're in Seattle, as I recall. And it's just one of those things where it's like, you start to see the concerts booking up. You start to see the tours, being announced. Being there and seeing that starting to open up, are you looking forward to it, or do you have hesitation about going out to seeing a live show or live theater?
I think my personal take on it is hesitation, and that I'm probably going to avoid live music for a while yet. And I think I just have too much concern over, not to rabbit hole on this topic, but I think I have too much concern about how the variants are going to interact with the crowds that we're going to see, and have reason to believe that, we're not out of the woods yet. And I don't want to rush into something. I spent a lot of time during the pandemic trying to make myself feel safe, and my wife and I have this, very shared attitude of, we're not going to get this. We're not going to get this. And it would be a drag if at the tail end of this phase of the pandemic for me to rush out and suddenly get nailed with the variants. It's just not what I want to do. So I'm probably going to be more careful for a while longer yet.
Now, being in Seattle, of course, people hear the word Seattle and then their minds drift to, Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains and Heart and Queensryche and bands of the like. But you're a fan more of electronica and acapella, especially acapella. Where did that love come from?
Well, I mean, so it's funny because when I think about the major musical events in my life, there was a point in time where I didn't know anything about electronic music, and a friend of mine handed me a small stack of electronic albums. And the three that I remember, I think, were The Orb, Oblivion, and Banco de Gaia, Last Train to Lhasa, and Orbital Insides. And to this day, those are three of my favorite albums. Like, I listen to them obsessively. So I have a friend to thank for that. And it helped me understand, like prior to that moment, I didn't totally get folks like Bjork, for instance, who were not electronic artists, but were incorporating electronic music into what they were doing in a way that I didn't get. And then afterwards, after this moment, I was like, oh, now I kind of understand things a little better. So it broadened my horizons when I was younger, for sure. Acapella music is not as straightforward to find good stuff for me these days. But I was in show choirs when I was in college, performance show choirs. And so you do a lot of, you get exposed to a lot of different kinds of music for voice, where we were doing, larger groups than like, somebody like the Nylons, which only has 4 people in it or whatever. And we would have 16 people. But through that kind of scene, I got exposed to acapella music. And for years, I dreamed that I could do an electronic inspired acapella group, something that had the ingenuity of sound, that you could see on an Orb album, but done with the voice. And Years later, I would come across a band called Sonos who actually pulled it off. And so I kind of went, all right, game over. I don't need to try this anymore. So it's not very common that you see that, but it's more and more common these days for people for you to see a cappella music where they're incorporating pedals and effects. The purists might say it's not pure a cappella, the point at which you are, adding effects, but I would argue it's probably not pure a cappella the moment they sing through a microphone either. I mean, that's a tool that changes what you're hearing. So I don't care. I just want to hear something that came from the voice that has some unique arrangement to it and some unique sonic properties as well. So
to people who don't really have an idea of what the acapella scene or acapella, professional acapella music would be like, of course their first instinct would be like Pitch Perfect, which probably not, but you do see groups come out like Pentatonics, like Van Campo, which is an actual metal acapella group. To someone who's wanting to get into it or is interested in acapella vocal harmonies and the like, if you were to basically hand someone a CD to kind of be that gateway drug into acapella, who would you recommend?
Well, I used to actually do that, hand out CDs to people that were like, this is focused on converting you to listening to acapella music. But that was 10 years ago and I haven't stayed current. So I wouldn't necessarily know where to start these days, unfortunately. There's there's acapella organizations that kind of do competitions every year. And that's a great way to see who's still, who's active and who's at the forefront. And it's funny because Pitch Perfect kind of, I think, inspired a lot of people. And there's probably more great music that came out of as a response to Pitch Perfect than you might expect. So at the collegiate level, there's always been some cutting edge stuff, because at the collegiate level where you've got these kids who are right in the middle of what's modern in terms of music, what's on the college radio stations and that kind of thing, converting that to a cappella music in a way that maybe adults out in the wild are not thinking to do. So that's another place that you can look, as you can get, most of these groups put out CDs every year. And if you're looking for an a cappella version of your favorite song, you can almost always find it. So that's one place to start. But I would hesitate to kind of say I know the scene anymore. I don't think I've been in touch for a long time.
I do have to ask, and I ask, the majority of the guests that come onto the show, if you remember the first time you ever went to a record store and with your own money actually bought an album, like whether it was saved up through, whatever part-time job or babysitting or allowance or whatever, the first time you went and bought an album for yourself. Do you remember that?
No, I don't. What I remember is the first album that was given to me as a present that I had asked for that started my collection. Like this isn't just my parents' records that I've been listening to. This is for me. And it was Styx Kilroy Was Here was the request. So I used to love singing along to that entire album. That's a concept album, come to think of it, and pretty theatrical in a lot of different ways. Their tour was very theatrical. They had costumes, they had all kinds of stuff. So it was, I didn't get to see the tour, but the music videos I saw some of back in the day. And,
Now, we mentioned that you have a book coming out. I think it's in January, Battle of the Linguist Mages. So for anyone who's curious on picking this book up, what can they expect?
Sure. Battle of the Linguist Mages is a story about a video gamer named Isabel who's playing a game called Sparkle Dungeon, which is a massive VR medieval rave-themed game. And it turns out that she's so good at the game that she gets recruited to participate in some shady cabal activities behind the scenes, as it were. She's pegged as someone who could be good for some nefarious schemes that roll all the way up to the governor of California. And over the course of the book, she discovers that her DJ skills in the game and her abilities, as a dancer and a DJ, have surprising benefits to her as she tries to survive this future world that the governor and the cabal are creating. So it's kind of It's at times very hilarious book, and at times very hair raising, but it's sort of epic level fantasy, but it's set in modern day America. It's not the classic swords and sorcery thing. It's more, I guess, I originally wanted to call it science fantasy, which is kind of a thing, but it's more contemporary fantasy, I guess you would call it, in the sense that it's happening right now in the story. Yeah.
That love of science fiction, the fact that there's a science fiction acapella, that these are in the more sci-fi fantasy realm. Where does that love come from? Like what were some of your earlier influences as far as writing?
Well, that's a good question, because when I was young, I would just read anything at the library. My mom would drop me off, and I would just I read so fast and so voraciously, and books for kids, you can rip through them if you have any aptitude and appetite for that stuff. So I was really agnostic about what I read. I didn't care. And then I think what turned me around was my mom showed me this TV show at one point called Battlestar Galactica, which is kind of a second-rate Star Wars. At the time, you couldn't see Star Wars every week, but for a stretch there, you could see Battlestar Galactica, and that kind of ignited a little bit of like, let's investigate science fiction. It wasn't until college, though, that I actually took a lit class focused on science fiction, an elective, and that kind of opened the doors for me, like, oh, I'm really missing out. There are some really amazing things going on in science fiction that my naive self didn't really cotton to. So the one that I remember the most from that class was The Forever War. Just blowing my mind, and we read it in comparison. We also read Starship Troopers so that the professor could kind of compare and contrast the two books. And as a young person, I just was floored. I was like, books can be in conversation with other books, and the world changes, and there's I was like 19 years old when this happened. So that kind of got me excited about really pursuing science fiction. I burned through a lot of Heinlein when I was young, which I'm not sure was the best choice of my was the best thing I could have done with my time, but there were reasons why something like Stranger in a Strange Land seemed really meaningful to me when I was young, and kind of exploring psychedelic culture at the same time, and there were crossover there, but I'm not sure there were too many like influences to say which one specifically got me going, but those are the ones that I remember.
Do you ever see yourself going back to your favorite band Cannot Save You and composing a soundtrack that basically are the songs that Beautiful Remorse, supposedly did in the book?
I think for starters, I'm probably not the best composer to do that, and I'm not that experienced a composer to begin with. So for starters, if someone were going to do that, I probably wouldn't be me. I would probably look for somebody who's got more of a vision, I guess. But the flip side of that is, doing that would kind of potentially leach some of the magic out of the books. People can bring their imagination to the book, and they can kind of go, this is what it sounds like. And you would rob them a little bit of that personal connection to just make an album. Now, the flip side would be if you were to make, a movie or a TV show or something where you're going to take the entire premise and take it from the realm of the book and make it something visual, that would be different. Like you would have to convert them somehow. But if you just wanted a standalone album to accompany the book, I probably wouldn't do that. And I probably wouldn't be the person to do that if it was going to happen, I think.
You mentioned at the start of the show, when talking about the book, that initial notion of being so overwhelmed by a song that it just kind of blows your mind. Has there ever been a song that has done that to you?
Boy, that's a good question. I don't think so. I mean, I think I've had moments where music has overwhelmed me, as a part of a context. And oftentimes, like, let's say when I was younger and more interested in like psychedelic drugs, for instance. So you could have an acid trip where a piece of music kind of blows you away, and then the next time you listen to it when you're sober, you go, oh, it's all right. I mean, it's a decent piece of music, not my favorite or whatever. But the one piece of music, now that I think about it, I remember I was coming down the stairs at a friend's house. And they were playing an Eric Whitacre piece, and I don't think I remember the name of it. It's Eric Whitacre is like a modern composer of classical music, or I guess it's not classical because it's modern, but oh God, it's going to plague me that I don't remember the name of it because it's a complicated name. But I was listening to it as I came down the stairs, and as I got closer and closer to the to the sound system, I remember I started crying. I was just like so moved by what I was hearing, and I couldn't explain it because I didn't, and I don't listen to. I'm really terrible about listening to lyrics. I think it was mostly the music that was hooking me, and really getting at me. And I've listened to that music, a lot since then, and it hasn't. You can only have that kind of reaction, I think, maybe once, and then after that, the element of surprise is gone, and that element was something that caught me. Was like, I don't believe that I didn't realize music could do this. I didn't believe it beforehand, but I definitely believe it now. And so the next time I hear it, I'll be less surprised that that's true. Yeah, I'll try to see if I can find that title and send it to you. But I
was about to say, if you do, let me know. We'll put it in the description below for people to go have that experience for themselves. But I think that brings us to a perfect point where it's time to ask you, Scotto Moore, if you had to introduce yourself to a total stranger by handing them a mixtape, not saying who you are, by handing them a mixtape, and on that tape are songs that tell the story of you, what songs are on that tape, and why are those songs there?
Yeah, I've been wrestling with that question, and I, every time I think about it, I just think that in terms of the progression of what I've listened to from start to finish, and having that be but that's not exactly what you're saying, because you're asking the story of my life, and that isn't exactly the story of what I've listened to. But I'm not sure I have a better way of expressing it on a mixtape. So, if it were going to be, here's me when I'm young, here's me kind of in my 20s and 30s, and then here's me today, it would start with something like Styx or Queen. I grew up in Iowa in the Midwest, where classic rock was the thing, and it still is the thing. And then I kind of got into the Monkees were on MTV at the time when I was in high school, I think. And so I became super fascinated with listening to the Monkees, and that led me to the Beatles, obviously. But then at some point I had that kind of experience where my friend gave me those electronic music records. And for years afterwards, all I listened to was electronic music. And then kind of the next big turning point for me was really getting into wanting to be a DJ and getting into house music as the entry point. So, like I could hand you collections from each of those phases, but I don't know that there's specific songs. Kind of Peter Gabriel's Secret World would be on there. That was a very meaningful track for me when I was in college and shortly after. My wife and I on our honeymoon went up and down the West Coast and saw Peter Gabriel 8 times. And I'm not as, passionate these days about Peter Gabriel as I used to be, but certainly there was a stretch of time where that was very important to me. There'd probably be a Tori Amos song on there. Probably Flying Dutchman was the thing that really meant a lot to me as an inspirational piece of music. It's really rough. As far as the Monkey song that would be on there would probably be The Door into Summer, which is a song that Mike Nesmith wrote. And it's just this wistful song about, watching your life kind of slip away. At least that's my interpretation. The lyrics are a little bit opaque, but that's how I read it. And if I were going to pick, an orb track to stick on there, you can't pick Blue Room because it's 40 minutes long. You need up an entire side of your mixtape, but there are edits of that are good. The huge ever pulsating brain at the center of the universe track is something that sticks out to me because of the first time I heard it was just, we were all getting ready to go to Lollapalooza the next day and we were like amped. And somebody said, have you heard this orb track, a huge ever pulsating brain that glows at the center of the universe? And it was so weird that somebody could even come up with that title that we sat down and listened to it. And it was just mind blowing. It was like, oh, this is, it didn't stick. I had to wait a couple of years later for my friend to give me that stack of electronic music to kind of really get its hooks in me. But I remember that experience. And then acapella wise, there are my friend, this band Sonos that I described did a cover of Everything in Its Right Place, and all acapella, and it's amazing. So I'd probably stick that on there. And then if I were going to pick a piece of house music to kind of represent me, there's an artist named Guy J who did a song called Airborne. And the first time I heard that was really what clicked me into house music. I was like, holy moly, this is taking electronic music and doing something that I hadn't seen or that I hadn't experienced, which is really give it this driving beat that you could dance to and kind of keeping the creative hooks, but really throwing it out there. So yeah, I tried and failed to come up with a full 90-minute arc for what I would put on a mixtape that tells the story of me. But I think if I had to, you could get a list of things that I've listened to that I loved, and those would probably be some of them.
For someone who is sitting there, listening to this and thinking, I would love to, write a play or write a scripted series or write that first novel, what advice would you give to them?
Well, I guess where I would start is, they say a kind of common piece of wisdom that goes around is to write every day. And it's a cutting edge. It's not something that is, how do I say this? It's a double-edged sword. That's what the phrase I was looking for, because you can, I don't write every day. I write when I feel motivated to write, but I think about it all the time. When I'm writing a book, if I don't get a chance to write that day, at least there's something going on in my mind. But I would say, don't get hung up on something like write every day until you actually kind of have a better sense of how to write in the first place. So don't get caught up in there's so much advice and it turns out to be so personal to the person that's giving the advice that if you're just getting started, it's hard to know whose advice to take because you don't know yet. You don't know enough to say. But the main thing I would say is just crank. You can't get better until you have to finish. You definitely have to finish what you start. And you can't get better until you can look back on a body of work and go, man, that was terrible. I'm going to do it better the next time. And that was the main thing for me is don't get hung up on, obviously rewriting a thing is important, but at some point write the next thing and make the next thing be where you incorporate all the lessons that you've learned from the previous thing that you wrote. If you don't finish anything, if you're constantly just noodling with revisions, you're never going to get to that state where you have a conclusion and you can kind of go, okay, this is what I learned. And so, partially what you see from me is just this enormous volume of work. And of course, I've been writing for a long time, but that's partially how I gained a sense of confidence. Was like, all right, I'm going to get through this, and it's going to stand on its own. And it may not be perfect, it may not be the best thing I ever write, but it's going to be there. I'm going to have it to look back on and to be proud of, on its own terms. So that's probably the first place I would start, and then. We can get into all kinds of nerdy discussions about writing and about writing courses and all that kind of stuff. But I think, you can get a lot out of the internet these days. For instance, I audited, thanks to YouTube, I was able to kind of sit through, Brandon Sanderson has this enormous collection of lectures about writing science fiction and fantasy, for instance, that I sat all the way through and just was riveted. And this is decades into me being a writer, and I still found a lot of value out of hearing, a true expert really kind of share his thoughts. And other things that I do are, you can follow, if you have a writer that you love, check and see if they have a Patreon, because a number of writers that I follow, at different levels of their Patreon, offer tips and tricks into their writing processes, like monthly lectures, or get a chance to sit on Twitch with some of these writers. You know, when I was young, you didn't have any of this. And now it's kind of a, you know, I wouldn't say it's a full-blown cornucopia or whatever, but more and more you're seeing the connection between the writer and their audience is more and more fleshed out. It's a little more direct. And so look for those opportunities too. Yeah.
The book is Your Favorite Band Cannot Save You. My guest has been Scotto Moore. Thank you so much for dropping in and being a guest on the show. How can we get in touch with you? How can we find all of your creations on the internet, and what is next?
If you go to scotto.org, you can find kind of the whole mess of what I promote these days. And then you can reach me, Scotto, at scotto.org, and eventually I get around to reading my inbox. I'm bad with email, but it'll happen. And Battle of the Linguist Mages comes out in January, so that's kind of the next big push. We're not in the middle of the promotional cycle for that yet, but it's going to start soon. And I could not be prouder of Battle of the Linguist Mages. I think it's kind of, you know, it takes everything that I've done and just kind of finally crystallizes it into something that I'm just super proud of in a way that I haven't been before. So I really hope you all get a chance to check it out.
Well, the first book here was a phenomenal read. I got lost in it. I think I polished it off in about a day. It was just one of those sucky win reads. So I'm really looking forward to the new books. Scotto, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is the Major Mixtape Podcast. If you're listening to us on any audio streaming service or on the Good Pods app, because if you really want to find good podcasts to listen to, that is a phenomenal place to go to. You can actually watch this entire video on YouTube as well. But if you're watching us on YouTube, you can actually go to one of those apps, download the episode, and listen to it on the go. This is the Major Mixtape Podcast. I'm your host, Jason. We will see you next time. Take care.